The gunshot echoed across the desolate plains, sending a flock of startled crows into the evening sky as Nathaniel Reynolds raced toward freedom, her breath coming in ragged gasps and the broken chains still dangling from her bloodied wrists. Arizona Territory, 1875, was unforgiving to everyone, but especially to a woman fleeing the corrupt law that had wrongfully imprisoned her. August Gus Blackwood reined in his paint horse atop the rocky ridge, squinting against the setting sun. The distant figure stumbling across the scrubland didn't move like a man, and those weren't the clothes of any Apache or Mexican he'd ever seen. When the glint of metal caught his eye chains reflecting the dying light, his hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip. He'd seen enough injustice in his 30 years to know trouble when he spotted it. Clicking his tongue, he urged his horse forward, dust kicking up behind them as they descended the slope toward the stranger. Nate heard the approaching hoofbeats and panicked. Another bounty hunter, perhaps, or worse, the sheriff's men. She'd escaped their wagon when it had overturned during a creek crossing, taking advantage of the confusion to flee into the wilderness. 3 days without proper food or water had left her weak, but desperation kept her moving. She ducked behind a large boulder, pressing her back against the sun-warmed stone. The chains felt impossibly heavy now. She clutched a jagged rock in her trembling hand, her only weapon. "Hello there," a deep voice called out. "I ain't looking for trouble." Nate remained silent, calculating her odds of outrunning a man on horseback. "I can see those chains from here," the voice continued, closer now. "Whoever's after you, I reckon they ain't far behind." The horse snorted, and Nate could hear the creak of leather as the rider dismounted. "I've got water," he said, "and tools that might help with those irons." Hunger, thirst, and exhaustion clouded her judgment. She peered around the edge of the boulder. The man standing before her wasn't wearing a lawman's badge. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin and a week's worth of stubble on his jaw, he looked like any other cowboy traversing the territory. His eyes, however, were unexpectedly kind beneath the brim of his weathered hat. "Who are you?" Nate demanded, her voice hoarse from thirst. "August Blackwood," he answered, keeping his distance. "Most folks call me Gus." He gestured toward her bonds. "Those look mighty uncomfortable." Nate stepped fully from behind the boulder, swaying slightly as her vision blurred. "I'm not a criminal," she managed to say before her knees buckled. Gus moved quickly, catching her before she hit the ground. "Easy now," he murmured, lowering her gently to sit on a flat rock. He uncorked his canteen and offered it to her. "Small sips," he advised. The water was warm but felt like heaven on her parched throat. Nate drank carefully, aware of his watchful gaze. "Name's Nathaniel Reynolds," she said after a moment, using her full name rather than the Nate she'd adopted for protection. "Though most call me Nate." Gus raised an eyebrow. "That's an unusual name for a lady." "It serves its purpose," she replied defensively. The loose prison dress she wore did little to hide her feminine form, but out on the trail, confusion about her gender had sometimes worked in her favor. He nodded, seeming to understand without further explanation. "Those chains," he said, nodding toward her wrists. "I've got tools in my saddlebag that might help, if you'll allow it." Nate hesitated, then extended her arms. What choice did she have? Gus retrieved a small leather pouch from his saddlebag and knelt before her. His hands were calloused but surprisingly gentle as he examined the iron shackles. "Prison issue," he noted, his expression darkening. "Arizona Territorial?" Nate nodded reluctantly. "I don't ask what people did to end up in chains," Gus said, working a thin metal pick into the lock mechanism. "But I've known enough innocent folks who've worn them." "I didn't kill that man," Nate said suddenly, the words bursting forth before she could stop them. My employer. They said I poisoned him for his money, but I didn't. I was just his housekeeper. Gus looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers. I believe you. The simple statement, delivered without hesitation, caught Nate off guard. No one had believed her, not the sheriff, not the judge, not even her court-appointed lawyer. The shackle on her right wrist clicked open, and Gus gently removed it, revealing the raw, bleeding skin beneath. His jaw tightened at the sight, but he said nothing as he began working on the second lock. Why are you helping me? Nate asked as the second shackle fell away. Gus sat back on his heels, considering his answer. I've seen what passes for justice out here, he finally said. And I've seen what happens to women in territorial prisons. He stood, offering his hand to help her up. No one deserves that. Nate took his hand cautiously, wincing as she rose to her feet. 3 days of running had left her muscles cramped and aching. My camp's about an hour's ride from here, Gus said, gathering the broken chains and shackles. You're welcome to rest there. Get some proper food. After that, well, that's your decision. Nate eyed his horse warily. And if I decide to leave now? Gus shrugged. Then I wish you luck. But there's a posse that comes through these parts regular like. And you look like you could use a meal and some bandages for those wrists before you go much further. He was right, of course. She was in no condition to continue on foot, especially as night approached. Still, years of hard lessons had taught her to be cautious. I won't harm you, Miss Reynolds, Gus said quietly, reading her hesitation. You have my word. Something in his steady gaze convinced her. Nate nodded slowly. Just until morning, she agreed. Gus helped her onto his horse before mounting behind her. She sat stiffly, uncomfortable with the proximity to this stranger, but too exhausted to protest. As they rode, the rhythm of the horse's gait and the warmth of Gus's solid presence behind her lulled her into a drowsy state. Been on the run long? Gus asked after they'd traveled in silence for some time. 3 days, Nate replied, forcing herself to stay alert. Transport wagon overturned at Bitter Creek. Guard broke his leg. I ran while the others were helping him. Gus whistled low. Bitter Creek's 15 miles south. You covered good ground on foot. Fear is a powerful motivator, she said dryly. They crested a small rise, and Gus's camp came into view below a simple affair with a small tent pitched near a rocky overhang, a fire pit, and a second horse tethered nearby. It's not much, he said as he helped her dismount. But it's secure. No one comes through this canyon except the occasional Apache hunting party, and they leave me be. Nate stumbled as her feet touched the ground, her legs refusing to cooperate after the long ride. Gus steadied her with a hand on her elbow, releasing her the moment she found her balance. Sit, he instructed, gesturing toward a flat rock near the fire pit. I'll get a fire going and find something for those wrists. Nate sank down gratefully, watching as Gus efficiently prepared the camp. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to life in the wilderness, gathering wood, starting a fire, and retrieving supplies from his packs without wasted motion. When he returned to her side with a small tin of salve and strips of clean cloth, Nate found herself relaxing slightly. If he meant her harm, he'd had ample opportunity already. This might sting, he warned, kneeling before her again. He dampened a cloth with water from his canteen and began gently cleaning the abrasions on her wrists. Nate bit her lip against the pain but didn't pull away. You've done this before, she observed. A shadow crossed his face. War leaves a man with certain skills. The war between the states? Gus nodded. Union Army. Medical Corps, for a time. That explained his gentle, practiced touch. Nate studied him as he worked, noting the faint lines around his eyes that suggested he was in his early 30s. perhaps 5 or 6 years older than herself. "There," he said, finishing the bandaging. "Keep them clean, and they should heal well enough." "Thank you," Nate said, the words feeling inadequate for what he'd done. Gus merely nodded, moving to prepare a simple meal of beans, jerky, and hardtack. They ate in companionable silence as darkness settled fully over the land. The only sounds the crackling fire and the occasional distant cry of a coyote. "You should get some rest," Gus said when they'd finished eating. "You can take the tent. I'll sleep out here by the fire." Nate hesitated. "I can't take your shelter." "You're not taking it," he replied firmly. "I'm offering it. Besides, I sleep under the stars more often than not." Too exhausted to argue further, Nate retreated to the small canvas tent. Inside, she found a bedroll laid out on a ground sheet, simple but clean. She sank onto it gratefully, intending only to rest for a moment before remaining vigilant, but sleep claimed her instantly. She woke with a start some hours later, heart racing from a nightmare of pursuers and chains. The camp was quiet, moonlight filtering through the tent canvas. Cautiously, Nate peered outside. Gus sat by the fire, his rifle across his knees, keeping watch. He turned at her movement, his expression questioning. "Just a dream," she said softly, embarrassed. He nodded in understanding. "They'll fade in time." Something in his tone suggested personal experience with such nightmares. Nate stepped fully from the tent, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders against the desert night's chill. "May I join you?" she asked hesitantly. Gus gestured to the space across the fire. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked as she settled on a rock. "Not well," she admitted. "I keep thinking they'll find me." "We're well off any trail," he assured her. "And I'm a light sleeper." Nate studied the man across the flames. "Why are you really helping me, Mr. Blackwood?" Gus was silent for a long moment, poking at the fire with a stick. "I've seen too many people suffer under unjust laws," he finally said. "During the war, after it. Seems to me the strong prey on the weak, and call it justice or progress or manifest destiny." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "Sometimes a man has to decide which side of that equation he stands on." "And you've decided?" "Long ago," he confirmed. "Does that satisfy your curiosity, Miss Reynolds?" "Nate," she corrected. "And yes, for now." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. "What will you do?" Gus eventually asked. "Come morning." It was the question Nate had been avoiding. "Head north, I suppose. Maybe Idaho Territory or Montana. Somewhere I can start fresh. It's dangerous country for a woman alone." "I've managed so far," she said defensively. Gus didn't argue. "There's a settlement about 3 days' ride from here. Haven, they call it. Small place, but decent folk. They don't ask too many questions of newcomers." "You've been there." "I trade there sometimes. They know me." He hesitated. "I'm headed that way myself. You'd be welcome to ride along if you've a mind to." Nate considered the offer. 3 days with this stranger versus the uncertainty of continuing alone, without supplies or a horse. "I don't have money to pay you for supplies or transport," she said. "I'm not asking for payment. Everyone wants something, Mr. Blackwood." He looked at her steadily. "Not everyone, Miss Reynolds. Sometimes folks just do what's right because it's right." Nate wanted to believe him. After everything she'd endured, the idea of someone helping without ulterior motives seemed almost fantastical. Yet there was something in August Blackwood's direct gaze that inspired trust. 3 days to Haven," she said finally. "Then we part ways." Gus nodded, apparently satisfied. "We'll leave at first light." They set out as dawn broke over the eastern ridges, Nate riding the second horse, a sturdy bay mare Gus called Penny. He'd offered her a spare set of clothes. Men's trousers, a cotton shirt, and a worn leather vest, all slightly too large but infinitely more practical than her prison garb. "They belong to my younger brother," Gus explained when she asked, a flicker of something painful crossing his face. "He doesn't need them anymore." Nate didn't press for details. Everyone in this harsh country carried their share of loss. They traveled steadily through the morning, Gus setting a pace that covered ground without exhausting the horses. He was a quiet companion, alert to their surroundings but not inclined to fill the silence with unnecessary chatter. Nate appreciated this. It gave her time to think, to plan what she might do when they reached Haven. By midday, the desert heat had become oppressive. Gus led them into a narrow canyon where a small spring bubbled from the rock face, creating a shaded oasis of cottonwoods and willows. "We'll rest here through the worst of the day," he said, dismounting. "No sense pushing the horses in this heat." Nate slid from Penny's back, her muscles protesting after hours in the saddle. She'd ridden before, but not recently, and certainly not across such rugged country. "You're doing well," Gus observed, noticing her discomfort. "Most folks would be complaining by now." "I've had worse discomforts," she replied, thinking of the hard wooden bench in the prison wagon, the shackles that had bitten into her flesh. Gus nodded, understanding without words. He unsaddled the horses and led them to drink while Nate stretched her aching limbs. "There's jerky and biscuits in that saddlebag," he called over his shoulder. "Help yourself." Nate found the food and settled in the shade of a large cottonwood. When Gus joined her, she offered him his share. "You said you were a housekeeper," he said as they ate. "Before everything." Nate nodded. "For Mr. Hollister, a banker in Prescott. Good position, fair pay." She sighed. "Until he died suddenly, and his nephew accused me of poisoning him for his money." "Did you stand trial?" "If you can call it that. It was decided before I ever stepped into the courtroom." She picked at a loose thread on her borrowed shirt. "Mr. Hollister had changed his will a month before, leaving me a small sum thanks for 5 years of service," he said. "His nephew couldn't accept that." "And no one spoke for you?" Nate shook her head. "I'm an orphan, Mr. Blackwood. No family, few friends. Easy target." Gus was quiet for a moment. "What would you do if you could start over?" The question caught her off guard. She'd been so focused on escape, on survival, that she hadn't allowed herself to think beyond the immediate future. "I don't know," she admitted. "I can cook, clean, manage a household. I can read and cipher well enough. Perhaps find another position as a housekeeper, though without references." She trailed off, the reality of her situation settling heavily upon her. "Haven needs people with skills," Gus said carefully. "It's a growing settlement. No lawman stationed there yet, just folks trying to make a life." Nate regarded him skeptically. "And they'd welcome a fugitive?" "They'd welcome someone willing to work hard," he corrected. "The past is the past." The simplicity of his worldview was both refreshing and naively optimistic, Nate thought. But perhaps, in a place like Haven, she could indeed start anew. They resumed their journey in the late afternoon when the worst of the heat had passed. As they rode, Gus occasionally pointed out landmarks or shared brief stories about the land they traversed. He knew the territory well, Nate realized, far better than most cowboys passing through. "You've been in Arizona a long time," she observed. "Since '68, he confirmed. "Came west after the war, looking for something. Peace, maybe." "Did you find it?" He considered the question seriously. "Not peace exactly, but purpose, perhaps." "As a cowboy?" A faint smile crossed his face. "I work cattle sometimes, drive herds up from Mexico or over to California when the pay is good. But mostly I scout for the army or guide settlers through the territory." "A man of many trades," Nate remarked. "Out here you adapt or you don't survive." They made camp that evening in a small clearing sheltered by a ring of boulders. As Gus prepared their simple meal, Nate found herself studying him with growing curiosity. He wasn't like the other men she'd encountered in the territory, not the rough cowboys, the opportunistic merchants, or the hard-eyed lawmen. There was a quietness to him, a thoughtfulness that seemed at odds with his obvious capability in this harsh land. "You're staring, Miss Reynolds," Gus said without looking up from the coffee he was brewing. Nate felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I was just wondering why a man with your skills would choose such a solitary existence." He handed her a tin cup of coffee before answering. "Some wounds heal better in solitude," he said simply. "The war." "Partly." He settled across from her, firelight casting shadows across his face. "Lost my brother at Shiloh. Parents passed within a year of each other after that. The family farm in Pennsylvania didn't feel like home anymore." "I'm sorry," Nate said softly. Gus shrugged. "It was a long time ago." He sipped his coffee. "What about you? You mentioned being an orphan." "Since I was 12, Nate confirmed. "Fever took my parents within days of each other. I was sent to a girls' home in St. Louis, then placed as a domestic in various households. When I turned 18, I decided to head west. The pay was better, and I'd heard women had more opportunities in the territories." "And did they?" "Some," she acknowledged. "Until I found myself accused of murder by a man whose word automatically outweighed mine." The bitterness in her voice hung in the air between them. "The world isn't fair," Gus said after a moment. "But there are still good places, good people in it." "Like Haven?" Nate asked skeptically. "Like Haven," he confirmed. "It's not perfect nowhere is, but they judge folks by their actions, not their past or their station." "It sounds too good to be true." "Maybe it is," Gus admitted. "But it's the closest thing to home I've found out here." The revelation surprised her. "You live there?" "When I'm not on the trail, yes. I have a small cabin just outside town." Nate digested this information. She'd assumed Gus was a drifter, a man without permanent ties. The knowledge that he had roots in Haven cast their journey and his offer of help in a different light. "Why didn't you mention this before?" she asked. Gus met her gaze steadily. "Would you have trusted me if I'd said I was taking you to the place where I live? Or would you have thought I had ulterior motives?" He had a point. Nate would have been immediately suspicious of such an offer. "I still might not stay in Haven," she said, feeling a sudden need to assert her independence. "That's your choice," Gus replied easily. "I'm just providing an option." They fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts as the fire burned lower. Eventually, Nate retreated to her bedroll, but sleep proved elusive. The revelation that Gus had connections in Haven complicated matters. If she went there with him, she would be known as someone associated with August Blackwood. It would make disappearing more difficult if the law ever tracked her there. Yet the alternative, continuing alone, without resources, was equally daunting. And there was something about Gus that inspired trust, despite her better judgment. Morning brought no clarity. They broke camp efficiently, barely speaking as they resumed their journey. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they traveled, the flat desert giving way to rolling hills dotted with scrub oak and juniper. Around midday, Gus suddenly raised his hand, signaling Nate to stop. He sat perfectly still in his saddle, head tilted slightly as if listening. "What is it?" Nate whispered, her heart rate accelerating. "Riders," Gus replied quietly, "coming fast from the south." The direction of Prescott and the prison she'd escaped from. Panic flared in Nate's chest. "It could be anyone," Gus said, reading her expression. "But let's not take chances." He scanned their surroundings, then pointed to a rocky outcropping about 100 yards east. "Head for those rocks." There's a wash behind them that leads into the hills. I'll meet you there. Where are you going? Nate asked, alarmed. To make sure they're not looking for you, he said grimly. If they are, I'll lead them away. If not, no harm done. They'll recognize me, she protested. Not if they don't see you. Gus handed her his rifle. Go now, stay low. If I'm not there in an hour, follow the wash northeast. It'll lead you to a trading post run by a man named Feathers. Tell him August sent you. He'll help. Before she could argue further, he turned his horse and rode back the way they'd come, leaving Nate with little choice but to follow his instructions. She urged Penny toward the rocks, keeping to low ground where possible. The wash Gus had mentioned was dry but deep, its banks offering good cover as she made her way upstream. Finding a spot where thick brush concealed both her and the horse, Nate dismounted and waited, the rifle clutched in her trembling hands. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Twice she heard distant voices carried on the wind, but couldn't make out words. Once, a single gunshot echoed across the hills, sending her heart into her throat. When Gus finally appeared at the mouth of the wash, leading his paint horse at a walk, Nate nearly collapsed with relief. Bounty hunters, he said without preamble as he reached her. 3 of them looking for an escaped prisoner. Woman charged with poisoning her employer. Nate felt the blood drain from her face. Did they describe me? Dark-haired woman, mid-20s, last seen wearing prison garb. Gus's expression was grim. They're offering $50 for information leading to your capture. $50 was a substantial sum in the territory, enough to tempt many a struggling settler or cowhand. What did you tell them? Nate asked, her mouth dry. That I'd seen a woman matching that description heading west yesterday, toward California. Gus mounted his horse. They believed me readily enough. My reputation in these parts is established. As what? As someone who knows the territory and doesn't lie. He nudged his horse forward. Which makes me feel all the more dishonorable for doing so today. Nate fell in beside him as they continued up the wash. I'm sorry to have put you in that position. Gus glanced at her. I made my choice when I helped you, Miss Reynolds. I don't regret it. He paused. But we should be more cautious going forward. Word travels fast, even in empty country. They traveled through the afternoon, keeping to less traveled paths. Gus was more vigilant now, frequently stopping to listen or to study the land ahead. His caution was justified. Twice more they spotted distant riders and altered their course to avoid them. By evening, Nate was exhausted from the constant tension. When they finally made camp in a small cave set into a hillside, she sank to the ground with relief. We'll reach Haven by midday tomorrow if we start early, Gus said as he built a small, smokeless fire at the cave's entrance. Those bounty hunters will be halfway to California by then, following a false trail. And if they realize they've been misled, then they'll likely return to Prescott for better information before setting out again. He handed her a strip of jerky. It buys us time, at least. Nate chewed the tough meat slowly. I've put you at risk, she said finally. If they discover you lied to them. I can handle myself, Gus assured her. Been doing it a long time. Still, I never intended to drag anyone else into my troubles. Sometimes trouble finds us whether we're looking for it or not, he replied philosophically. The measure of a person is how they face it when it comes. Nate studied him across the small fire. You're an unusual man, Mr. Blackwood. A faint smile touched his lips. So I've been told. They set out before dawn, traveling through the gray half-light of early morning. As the sun rose, the landscape changed subtly, the harsh desert giving way to more varied terrain with stands of pine and oak in the hollows, clear streams cutting through rocky valleys. It was beautiful in its rugged way, Nate thought, a stark contrast to the bleak prison yard she'd left behind. "There," Gus said suddenly, pointing ahead where the trail curved around a large outcropping. "Haven Valley." They crested the rise, and the settlement spread out below them, a cluster of perhaps 30 buildings nestled in a green valley bisected by a small river. Fields of corn and wheat surrounded the town proper, and livestock grazed in fenced pastures. It looked peaceful, prosperous even by territorial standards. "It's larger than I expected," Nate admitted. "Grown considerably in the last year," Gus agreed. "The railroad's talking about putting a spur line through here. That would change everything." As they descended toward the settlement, Nate felt her anxiety rising. After days in the wilderness with only Gus for company, the prospect of facing strangers' potential threats was daunting. "Remember," Gus said quietly as they approached the outskirts, "in Haven, you're just a traveler passing through. Nothing more, nothing less." Nate nodded, straightening her shoulders. The men's clothing she wore would help conceal her identity, at least from a distance. With her hair tucked under a hat and dust coating her face, she could pass for a young man to casual observers. The first buildings they passed were simple homesteads, log cabins with small garden plots and chicken coops. Children played in the yards, pausing to wave as Gus and Nate rode past. Gus returned their greetings with easy familiarity. "You know them all," Nate observed. "Most," he confirmed. "Haven's still small enough for that." The main street was wider, lined with more substantial buildings, a general store, a blacksmith's forge, what appeared to be a small hotel, and various other businesses. People moved about their daily tasks, some nodding to Gus as they passed. "The Wayfarer," Gus said, indicating the hotel. "Clean rooms, decent food. You can stay there while you decide your next steps." Nate glanced at him. "And where will you be?" "My cabin's about a mile outside town," he replied. "But I'll be around if you need anything." They dismounted in front of the hotel, a 2-story wooden structure with a wide porch across the front. Nate hesitated, suddenly reluctant to part from the one person in the territory she trusted. "I don't have money for a room," she reminded him. Gus reached into his pocket and produced several coins. "This should cover a few nights, meals included." Nate shook her head. "I can't accept that." "Consider it a loan," he said firmly. "You can repay me when you're settled." Before she could protest further, the hotel door opened, and a stout woman with iron-gray hair stepped onto the porch. "August Blackwood," she called, her face breaking into a smile. "About time you showed your face in town again. Martha Wilson's been asking after you for that venison you promised her." "Hello, Mrs. Duncan," Gus replied, touching the brim of his hat. "I'll get to Martha's venison soon enough. In the meantime, my friend here needs a room for a few days. Just arrived in the territory and looking to get situated." Mrs. Duncan turned appraising eyes on Nate. For a terrifying moment, Nate thought the woman would see through her disguise, but then she simply nodded. "We've got a nice room at the back. Quiet like," she said. $2 a night, includes breakfast and supper." Gus handed over the coins. "That should cover 4 nights." Mrs. Duncan pocketed the money with a businesslike nod. "I'll have hot water sent up for washing. Supper's at 6 sharp." She disappeared back into the hotel. "She didn't ask my name," Nate said quietly. "She will eventually," Gus replied. "But folks here understand the value of privacy." He hesitated. "What name will you give?" Nate had considered this during their journey. "Natalie," she decided. "Natalie Ross." "Good choice," Gus approved. "Similar enough to your real name that you'll respond naturally to it." A boy of about 12 appeared from around the side of the hotel. "Take care of your horses, mister?" he asked hopefully. "Just one," Gus replied, handing the boy Penny's reins. "The bay mare." She'll need a good rub-down and extra oats. Yes, sir, the boy said eagerly, accepting the coin Gus flipped him. As the boy led Penny away, Gus turned back to Nate. Get some rest, he advised. Clean up, have a proper meal. I'll come by tomorrow to see how you're settling in. Nate found herself unexpectedly reluctant to see him go. Thank you, she said, the words wholly inadequate for what he'd done. For everything. Gus smiled, a rare full smile that transformed his solemn face. You're welcome, Miss Ross, he said, using her new name with deliberate emphasis. Welcome to Haven. With that, he mounted his paint horse and rode away, leaving Nate standing alone before the hotel, facing an uncertain future but, for the first time in many days, feeling a cautious spark of hope. Mrs. Duncan showed Nate to a small but clean room on the second floor, overlooking the stable yard. True to her word, hot water for washing arrived shortly thereafter, carried by a young girl who barely glanced at Nate before retreating. Alone at last, Nate sank onto the bed, overcome by the events of the past days. From prisoner to fugitive to what? A new beginning, perhaps, in this remote settlement. If she could remain undetected. If the bounty hunters didn't track her here. If Haven truly was the welcoming place Gus believed it to be. Too many ifs, but for now, she had shelter, food, and a temporary reprieve from pursuit. It would have to be enough. She washed carefully, mindful of her still healing wrists, and changed into the spare shirt Gus had provided. Her prison dress she bundled into a tight ball and stuffed under the mattress, unsure what to do with the incriminating garment. Supper, served in the hotel's small dining room, was simple but satisfying beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie. Nate ate quietly, keeping her hat pulled low and offering only brief responses to Mrs. Duncan's occasional questions. The few other diners, a traveling salesman and an elderly couple, paid her little attention, for which she was grateful. After the meal, exhaustion overtook her, and she retired to her room. The bed, though narrow, felt luxurious after days of sleeping on the ground. Nate fell asleep almost instantly, lulled by the unfamiliar comfort and relative security. She woke late the next morning, disoriented momentarily by the unfamiliar surroundings. Sunlight streamed through the small window, indicating she'd slept well past dawn. The sounds of the settlement drifted up from the street below, wagon wheels on packed dirt, voices calling greetings, a dog barking. After a hasty breakfast in the hotel dining room, Nate ventured outside, still dressed in men's clothing with her hat pulled low. She needed to assess Haven, to determine if it could truly offer the sanctuary Gus had promised. The main street was busier than it had appeared the previous evening. Wagons and riders moved in both directions, and the various businesses seemed to be doing steady trade. Nate walked slowly, observing the settlement and its inhabitants. The general store caught her attention, a large, well-maintained building with a wide porch. A sign in the window advertised for help, and Nate paused, considering. A position there would provide income and, potentially, information about newcomers to the area, including any bounty hunters who might arrive. Thinking of applying? A voice asked behind her. Nate turned to find Gus standing there, looking fresh and rested in a clean shirt, his ever-present hat shading his eyes. Perhaps, she replied. I need work if I'm to stay. Old man Jenkins is fair, Gus said, nodding toward the store. Pays on time, doesn't ask too many questions. Do you think he'd hire a woman? His daughter ran the place before she married and moved to Tucson, Gus replied. He's not opposed to female help. Nate hesitated. But my situation is your business, Gus finished firmly. In Haven, folks judge you on what you do, not what you might have done elsewhere. His confidence was reassuring, but Nate remained cautious. And if someone comes looking? Then we'll deal with that if it happens, he said simply. In the meantime, you need to live. He was right, of course. She couldn't hide in her hotel room indefinitely, especially with limited funds. I'll speak with Mr. Jenkins, she decided. Gus nodded approvingly. Good. And afterward, if you're amenable, I thought you might like to see more of Haven. Get your bearings. The invitation was unexpected but not unwelcome. I'd like that, Nate said. I'll wait here while you speak with Jenkins, Gus offered, settling onto a bench outside the store. Inside, the general store was well-stocked and meticulously organized. A gray-haired man with spectacles perched on his nose stood behind the counter, carefully tallying figures in a ledger. Help you? He asked without looking up. I noticed your sign, Nate said, gesturing toward the window. About needing help. Now the man, presumably Jenkins, raised his head, regarding her with shrewd eyes. You looking for work? Yes, sir. He frowned slightly. You're new to Haven. Just arrived yesterday, Nate confirmed. I'm Natalie Ross. Jenkins studied her for a moment. Any experience in a store? I've worked as a housekeeper, Nate said truthfully. I can keep accounts, stock shelves, manage inventory. I'm a quick learner. The storekeeper considered this. Pays $3 a week to start. 6 days, sunup to sundown. Sundays off. He paused. Trial basis for the first month. It was a fair offer, better than Nate had expected. When would you like me to start? Tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock, Jenkins said decisively. Freight wagons coming in. Need help unloading and sorting. I'll be here, Nate promised. Outside, Gus stood as she approached. Well? He asked. I start tomorrow, she replied, unable to keep a note of satisfaction from her voice. Mr. Jenkins is giving me a month's trial. Congratulations, Gus said warmly. That's excellent news. As they walked down the main street, Gus pointed out various landmarks: the blacksmith's forge where a massive man hammered at glowing metal, the small church that doubled as a schoolhouse during the week, the doctor's office where a harried-looking woman in her 40s tended to patients. That's Dr. Eleanor Simmons, Gus explained, one of the few female doctors in the territory. Folks come from 50 miles around to see her. A woman doctor, Nate marveled. And the town accepts her? They more than accept her, Gus replied. They respect her. Saved more lives than anyone can count during the fever outbreak last winter. They continued their tour, eventually reaching the outskirts of town where the settlement gave way to scattered homesteads and small farms. Gus seemed to know everyone they passed, exchanging greetings and brief news with an easy familiarity that spoke of belonging. You're well liked here, Nate observed as they paused by the small river that ran through the valley. Gus shrugged, looking slightly uncomfortable with the observation. I try to be useful, he said simply. Is that why you helped me? Nate asked. To be useful? He considered her question seriously. I helped you because it was the right thing to do, he finally said. Because I've seen too many people crushed by systems that care more for power than justice. He met her gaze directly. And because when I saw you running with those chains, I couldn't bear to see another person in bondage. The raw honesty in his voice caught Nate off guard. She looked away, suddenly self-conscious. Well, she said after a moment, I'm grateful, whatever your reasons. They walked in companionable silence for a time, following the river as it wound through the valley. The afternoon sun was warm but not oppressive, and the sound of water flowing over stones created a peaceful backdrop. My cabin's just over that rise, Gus said eventually, pointing to a wooded hillside about a quarter-mile distant. Not much to look at, but it serves its purpose. You live alone? Nate asked, then immediately regretted the personal nature of the question. If Gus found it intrusive, he didn't show it. Yes, he replied simply. Have since I settled here. No wife? Family? The questions continued before Nate could stop herself. A shadow crossed his face. There was someone once. During the war. She married another while I was away fighting. He shrugged. It was for the best. I wasn't the same man when I returned. The quiet pain in his voice resonated with Nate. She too had lost parts of herself over the years, first as an orphan, then as a servant in others' homes, and finally as a prisoner wrongfully accused. I understand, she said softly. The person I was before Prescott. Sometimes I barely remember her. Gus nodded, accepting her words without platitudes or false comfort. Perhaps Haven can be a place for both of us to remember who we were meant to be, he suggested. The sentiment was unexpectedly poetic coming from the stoic cowboy. Nate found herself smiling. Perhaps it can. They turned back toward town as the afternoon waned. When they reached the hotel, Gus hesitated. I'll be heading out at first light tomorrow, he said. Scout work for the army. Checking reports of Apache movement north of here. Nate felt a twinge of disappointment. How long will you be gone? A week, maybe 2. He regarded her seriously. Will you be all right here alone? The concern in his voice was touching, but Nate bristled slightly at the implication that she needed protection. I've been taking care of myself for a long time, Mr. Blackwood, she reminded him. Of course, he said quickly. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. Nate softened. I appreciate your concern, but with the job at Jenkins' store and a roof over my head, I'll manage just fine until you return. Gus nodded, appearing relieved. If you need anything while I'm gone, Martha Wilson, she runs the bakery, is a good friend. Just tell her I sent you. I will, Nate promised. Be careful out there. Always am, he replied with a small smile. He touched the brim of his hat in farewell. Good luck with Jenkins tomorrow. Nate watched him walk away, an unexpected sense of loss settling over her. In just a few days, August Blackwood had become her only ally in a hostile world. His absence would leave her truly alone again. The job at Jenkins' general store proved both challenging and fortuitous. The work was demanding heavy lifting, long hours on her feet, meticulous accounting, but it kept Nate too busy to dwell on her precarious situation. More importantly, it positioned her to hear news and gossip from throughout the region. Within days, she had established a routine. She rose before dawn, took breakfast at the hotel, and arrived at the store by 6. Jenkins was a taskmaster but fair, gradually assigning her more responsibility as she proved her competence. The townspeople accepted her presence with minimal curiosity, something Nate attributed partly to her subdued demeanor and partly to Haven's general live attitude. She maintained her disguise of loose men's clothing and kept her interactions brief and professional, deflecting personal questions with vague responses about starting fresh in the Arizona territory. By the end of her first week in Haven, Nate had saved enough from her wages to purchase a few necessities: a second shirt, proper trousers that actually fit, sturdy boots to replace the worn ones Gus had given her. She'd also secured a small room above the milliner's shop, cheaper than the hotel and more private. She found herself watching the trail from town, hoping for Gus's return, even as she reminded herself not to become dependent on his protection. Haven was proving to be the sanctuary he'd promised, but Nate knew better than to lower her guard entirely. The wanted posters with her name and description could arrive any day. 10 days after Gus's departure, Nate was stocking shelves in the store when the bell above the door jingled. She turned to see 3 dusty riders enter, hard-looking men with the watchful eyes of those accustomed to hunting, whether game or human. "Help you, gentlemen?" Jenkins called from behind the counter. The lead man, tall with a graying beard and a long-heeled scar across his left cheek, approached. "Looking for supplies," he said gruffly. "And information." Nate kept her head down, continuing her work while straining to hear the conversation. "What kind of information?" Jenkins asked, his tone neutral. The man slapped a folded paper on the counter. "Looking for this woman. Escaped prisoner from Prescott. Reward for her capture." Nate's blood ran cold. She forced herself to continue stacking cans of beans, fighting the urge to flee. Jenkins studied the paper. "Haven't seen anyone matching this description," he said evenly. "When did she escape?" "Nearly 2 weeks ago," the man replied. "Trail led us west initially, but we got word she might have doubled back this way." "Lot of territory to cover," Jenkins observed. "That's why we're asking in every settlement," the second man interjected. $50 is good money for just pointing a finger." Nate risked a glance toward the counter. Jenkins was handing the paper back, his expression unreadable. "If I see her, I'll send word to the sheriff in Prescott," he said. The lead bounty hunter studied Jenkins for a moment, then nodded. "See that you do." He turned, surveying the store, his gaze passing over Nate without lingering. "We'll need coffee, flour, and ammunition," he told Jenkins, planning to be in the area for a few days. As Jenkins filled their order, Nate retreated to the storeroom, her heart pounding. The bounty hunters hadn't recognized her in her men's clothing, but how long before someone made the connection? And what would Jenkins do if he realized the woman they sought was working in his store? When the men finally left, Nate emerged cautiously. Jenkins was standing by the window watching them mount up. "Bounty hunters," he said without turning. "Always trouble, that sort." Nate made a non-committal sound, unsure how to respond. Jenkins turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "Curious thing about that wanted poster," he remarked. "Woman they're looking for is accused of poisoning her employer. Reminds me of a story August Blackwood told me when he recommended I hire you." Nate froze, her hand tightening on the broom she just picked up. "Story about a woman wrongfully accused," Jenkins continued, watching her carefully. "Woman who needed a fresh start." "Mr. Jenkins," Nate began, but he held up a hand. "Don't much care what happened in Prescott," he said firmly. "You've been a good worker, honest and diligent. That's all that matters to me." He paused. "But those men will be asking around town. Might be best if you keep out of sight for a few days." Relief and gratitude flooded through Nate. "Thank you," she whispered. Jenkins nodded briskly. "Take the back exit when you leave today. And Natalie, be careful." For the next 3 days, Nate maintained a low profile, working in the storeroom rather than the main floor of Jenkins' store and avoiding the main street during daylight hours. The bounty hunters remained in Haven, asking questions, showing the wanted poster, watching. On the 4th day, as Nate was inventorying supplies in the storeroom, the back door opened suddenly. She whirled, reaching for a nearby hammer as a weapon, only to find Gus standing there, dusty from the trail but blessedly familiar. "You're back," she said, lowering the hammer. "Rode in an hour ago," he replied, closing the door behind him. "Martha told me about our visitors." "Bounty hunters," Nate confirmed grimly. "3 of them. They've been showing my wanted poster all over town." Gus's expression darkened. "Has anyone recognized you?" "Jenkins figured it out," she admitted. "But he's keeping my secret. No one else seems to have made the connection yet." "Good." Gus ran a hand through his hair, leaving it standing in dusty spikes. "But it's not safe for you to stay in town while they're here." "I can't just disappear," Nate protested. "It would only draw attention." "You won't disappear," Gus said. "You'll come to my cabin. Just until they move on." The suggestion caught Nate off guard. "Your cabin? It's isolated, defensible if necessary. They won't think to look there." He met her gaze steadily. "I know it's not proper, but Propriety is the least of my concerns right now, Nate interrupted. The prospect of hiding at Gus's cabin was far preferable to waiting for the bounty hunters to recognize her. When do we leave? Tonight after dark, Gus replied. Pack only what you need. I'll meet you behind the milliner's shop at 9. True to his word, Gus appeared precisely at 9, leading both his paint horse and Penny. Nate had already prepared a small bundle of necessities, her spare clothes, the little money she'd saved, a book borrowed from Jenkins. Jenkins knows I'm leaving? She asked as Gus helped her mount. Yes, Gus confirmed. He thinks it's a wise precaution. Said to tell you your job will be waiting when it's safe to return. They rode in silence through the darkness, avoiding the main trails. Gus led them on a circuitous route, doubling back several times to ensure they weren't followed. It was nearly midnight when they finally reached his cabin. In the moonlight, Nate could make out a sturdy log structure nestled against a hillside, partially concealed by pine trees. A small corral stood nearby, and what appeared to be a garden plot stretched along one side of the clearing. Inside, the cabin was simple but well-crafted, one main room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table and chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and various shelves and hooks holding supplies and tools. Everything was meticulously organized, reflecting Gus's orderly nature. It's not much, he said, lighting a lamp, but it's secure. It's perfect, Nate replied honestly. After prison cells and hotel rooms, the cabin felt wonderfully solid and real. Gus built a small fire to ward off the night's chill, then retrieved blankets from a trunk. You take the bed, he said. I'll sleep by the fire. Nate wanted to protest, to insist she could take the floor, but exhaustion overrode her pride. Thank you, she said simply. Later, lying in Gus's narrow bed, surrounded by his scent leather, pine, something indefinably masculine, Nate found herself reflecting on the strange turns her life had taken. 2 weeks ago, she'd been a fugitive in chains, certain of recapture. Now she was in hiding still, but with allies, a job to return to, and a growing sense of possibility. And then there was Gus himself, the taciturn cowboy who'd broken her chains and offered her freedom, asking nothing in return. She could hear him now, breathing steadily near the fire, a reassuring presence in the darkness. For the first time since her escape, Nate allowed herself to truly rest. The next few days established an unexpected domestic routine. Gus rode into town each morning to gather news and supplies, returning by midday. Nate occupied herself with the cabin, cooking, cleaning, tending the small garden. It was familiar work, reminiscent of her duties as a housekeeper, but performed now by choice rather than necessity. The bounty hunters are still asking questions, Gus reported on the third day, unloading supplies from his saddlebags. But they're getting frustrated. No one's given them any useful information. They won't leave empty-handed, Nate said, kneading dough for biscuits. Not with $50 at stake. They will if they believe you've moved on, Gus replied. I've been spreading rumors that a woman matching your description was seen heading north toward the Colorado River. Nate looked up, surprised. You're deliberately misleading them? I'm creating confusion, he corrected. Others in town are doing the same. Martha mentioned seeing someone like you boarding a stage to Tucson. Dr. Simmons suggested you might have gone east with a group of miners. Why would they do that? Nate asked, genuinely puzzled. They barely know me. Gus shrugged. Haven protects its own. But I'm not. You are, he interrupted gently. Whether you realize it or not. The idea was both comforting and unsettling. Nate had spent so long being an outsider, the orphan, the servant, the accused, that belonging somewhere felt almost foreign. What if the bounty hunters don't give up? She asked, returning to her biscuits. Then we'll consider other options, Gus said. Perhaps a more permanent relocation, New Mexico territory, or even California. The "we" in his statement didn't escape Nate's notice. She glanced at him, but his expression revealed nothing as he continued unpacking supplies. On the 5th day of her exile, Gus returned from town earlier than usual, his expression grim. "What's happened?" Nate asked immediately, setting aside the shirt she'd been mending. "The bounty hunters are leaving," he said, "but they've posted notices all over town. $50 for information about Nathaniel Reynolds, escaped prisoner." He paused. "The reward increases to 75 if you're captured alive." Nate sank into a chair. "So even if they leave, the danger remains," Gus finished. "Anyone passing through who recognizes you could send word." "I can't stay hidden forever," Nate said, frustration evident in her voice. "And I can't ask you to keep sheltering me here." "You're not asking," Gus replied firmly. "I'm offering." He hesitated. "But you're right that this isn't a permanent solution." Nate stood and paced the small cabin, thinking. "What about proving my innocence?" she suggested suddenly. "If I could somehow show that Mr. Hollister wasn't poisoned, how would you do that?" Gus asked, not unkindly. "The man is buried, the evidence long gone." "His nephew," Nate insisted. "He's the one who accused me. If there was a way to prove he lied." Gus considered this. "It would be dangerous," he warned. "Returning to Prescott, investigating a man who's already proven he can manipulate the law against you. More dangerous than living as a fugitive for the rest of my life?" Nate challenged. "Then putting you and the people of Haven at risk by staying here?" Gus had no answer for that. He removed his hat, running a hand through his hair in a gesture Nate had come to recognize as a sign of deep thought. "If we were to attempt this," he said slowly, "we would need help. Information from Prescott, legal advice." "We," Nate repeated, catching the pronoun again. Gus met her gaze directly. "You didn't think I'd let you face this alone, did you?" The simple declaration sent an unexpected warmth through Nate's chest. "It's not your fight," she said softly. "It became my fight when I broke those chains," Gus replied. "And it's the right thing to do." They spent the evening planning, considering various approaches to investigating Hollister's death. Gus knew a former lawman in Prescott who might be willing to make discreet inquiries. There was also the possibility of consulting Dr. Simmons about poisons and their detection. "It won't be quick," Gus cautioned as they sat before the fire, nursing cups of coffee. "And there's no guarantee we'll find anything useful." "I understand," Nate said, "but I have to try. Living in hiding, always looking over my shoulder, that's not really freedom." Gus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "No, it's not." He hesitated. "While we work on clearing your name, you should stay here. It's safer than town." The prospect of remaining in Gus's cabin for an extended period brought conflicting emotions. On one hand, Nate valued her independence, hard-won through years of self-reliance. On the other, she felt secure here in a way she hadn't experienced since childhood. "I'll contribute," she said firmly. "I can tend the garden, maintain the cabin, hunt if necessary." "I wouldn't expect otherwise," Gus replied with a small smile. "You're not one to accept charity, I've noticed." "Neither are you," Nate observed. "Yet you offer help freely to others." "That's different." "How so?" Gus considered the question. "Helping others isn't charity," he finally said. "It's connection. Recognizing that we're all broken in some way, all fighting our own battles." The insight revealed a depth to Gus that continued to surprise Nate. Behind his quiet, capable exterior lay a man of profound thought and feeling. "Well," she said, rising to bank the fire for the night, "I'm grateful for the connection, Mr. Blackwood." His smile in response was warm enough to rival the glowing embers. As am I, Miss Reynolds. The next morning, Gus rode to Haven to set their plan in motion. He would send telegrams to contacts in Prescott, arrange for Dr. Simmons to visit the cabin, and gather any information the bounty hunters might have left behind. Alone in the cabin, Nate busied herself with chores, sweeping the plank floor, organizing the meager pantry, mending a tear in one of Gus's shirts. The domestic tasks were soothing, giving her hands purpose while her mind worked through the challenges ahead. By mid-afternoon, restlessness drove her outside. The day was pleasant, with a light breeze carrying the scent of pine from the surrounding hills. Nate explored the clearing around the cabin, familiarizing herself with her temporary home. The garden showed signs of careful tending, neat rows of vegetables, trellises for climbing beans, even a small patch of herbs. Beyond it, a path led into the woods, presumably to a water source. Nate followed it, discovering a clear stream tumbling over rocks about 50 yards from the cabin. She was kneeling by the water, enjoying its cool freshness on her face, when a sound caught her attention: hoofbeats, approaching rapidly. Too soon for Gus to be returning. Heart pounding, Nate retreated into the trees, concealing herself behind a large pine as a rider came into view on the path from town. Not one of the bounty hunters, she noted with relief, but a young man she recognized from Haven, the blacksmith's apprentice. He reined in his horse near the cabin, calling out, "Mr. Blackwood? You there?" When no answer came, he dismounted and approached the cabin cautiously. Nate remained hidden, unsure of his purpose. The young man knocked on the cabin door, waited, then turned to leave, but not before attaching something to the door. Only after he'd ridden away did Nate emerge from her hiding place. Approaching the cabin cautiously, she found a folded note secured to the door with a nail. Blackwood. It read in a hurried scrawl, "Bounty hunters returned. Asking specifically about you now. Martha says stay away from town. We'll send more news when safe." Nate read the note twice, cold dread settling in her stomach. The bounty hunters were now targeting Gus because of her, and he was in Haven, unaware of their return. She had to warn him, but how? She had no horse. Gus had taken both when he left that morning. The walk to town would take hours, and she risked being seen. As she debated her options, another sound reached her: multiple horses, moving at a steady pace along the main trail to the cabin. Not from the direction of town, but from the north. Nate darted inside the cabin, searching frantically for a weapon. Gus's rifle was gone. He'd taken it with him, but she found a shotgun mounted above the fireplace and a revolver in a drawer by the bed. She grabbed the revolver, checking that it was loaded before moving to the window. 3 riders approached the clearing, and to her horror, Nate recognized them as the bounty hunters who'd come to Jenkins' store. They were following the path directly to the cabin, moving with the confidence of men who knew exactly where they were going. Someone in Haven had betrayed them. Nate's mind raced through options. She could hide in the woods, but the men would surely search the area thoroughly. She could confront them, but she was outnumbered and, despite the revolver, outgunned. She could surrender, sparing Gus further involvement, but the thought of returning to prison, to a hanging, was unbearable. The decision was made for her when the lead bounty hunter called out, "We know you're in there, Reynolds. Come out peacefully, and no one gets hurt." They knew she was alone. Somehow they'd intercepted Gus in town, or been told he'd left her at the cabin. Either way, her position was compromised. "I'm coming out," she called, tucking the revolver into the back of her trousers, concealed by her loose shirt. "Don't shoot." She stepped onto the cabin's small porch, hands raised. The 3 men had spread out in a semicircle, rifles trained on her. "Nathaniel Reynolds," the leader said with satisfaction. "Or should I say, Natalie? You've led us quite a chase." "How did you find me?" Nate asked, stalling for time, desperately hoping Gus would somehow return. The bounty hunter smirked. Money loosens tongues, even in a tight-lipped place like Haven. So someone had betrayed her for the reward. Nate felt a stab of disappointment but pushed it aside. What mattered now was survival. "Where's Blackwood?" another hunter demanded. "The cowboy who's been hiding you?" "Gone," Nate replied truthfully. "He won't be back until evening." The leader nodded to his companions. "Check the cabin and the surrounding area. Make sure she's alone." As one man dismounted and approached the cabin, Nate tensed. The revolver pressed against her lower back, a last resort she hoped not to use. Violence had never been her nature, but neither was surrender to injustice. The search was brief but thorough. "She's alone," the man confirmed, emerging from the cabin. "No sign of Blackwood." "Mount up," the leader ordered Nate. "You're riding with me back to Prescott. There's a hanging waiting for you there." "I'm innocent," Nate said, making no move toward the horses. "Mr. Hollister wasn't poisoned. His nephew lied to get his inheritance." The bounty hunter shrugged. "Not my concern. I just collect the reward." "What about Blackwood?" the third man asked. "The poster said he's wanted for aiding an escaped prisoner." "We'll come back for him," the leader decided. "One prisoner at a time." He dismounted and approached Nate, manacles dangling from his hand. "Now, are you coming peacefully, or do we do this the hard way?" Nate's hand inched toward the concealed revolver. She wouldn't go back to prison, wouldn't hang for a crime she didn't commit. If this was her last stand, so be it. Before she could draw the weapon, a shot rang out from the trees to her left. The bounty hunter nearest the cabin cried out, clutching his shoulder as he fell. "Get down!" a familiar voice shouted, and Nate dropped to the porch floor as more shots followed in rapid succession. The bounty hunters scrambled for cover, returning fire toward the trees. Nate crawled to the edge of the porch, drew the revolver, and fired at the leader, forcing him to duck behind his horse. The firefight was brief but intense. When it ended, two of the bounty hunters were wounded, one in the shoulder, the other in the leg, while the third had surrendered, hands raised high. Gus emerged from the trees, rifle trained on the men. His expression was cold, focused, revealing the soldier he'd once been. "You all right?" he called to Nate without taking his eyes off the bounty hunters. "Yes," she replied, relief flooding through her. "How did you know?" "Ran into Martha on my way back to town," Gus explained tersely. "She'd heard rumors the bounty hunters were asking about my cabin." He gestured with his rifle. "Drop your weapons. All of them." The bounty hunters complied reluctantly, their guns thudding to the dirt. "The law will hunt you for this, Blackwood," the leader growled, pressing a handkerchief to a graze on his arm. "Interfering with lawful bounty hunters is a hanging offense. So is attempting to return an innocent woman to a corrupt court," Gus replied evenly. He turned to Nate. "There's rope in the cabin. We need to secure them while we decide what to do." The next hour passed in tense activity. Nate and Gus bound the bounty hunters, treated their wounds, and confiscated their weapons and horses. Then, over the prisoners' protests, they retreated to the cabin to confer. "We can't keep them tied up indefinitely," Nate said quietly. "And if we let them go, they'll bring back reinforcements." "I know," Gus agreed grimly. "But I've got news from Prescott that might change everything." He reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a folded telegram. "This arrived just before I left town. It's from my contact in Prescott, a former judge named Harrington." Nate took the paper with trembling hands and read, "Hollister death reinvestigated. Stop. Doctor confirms natural causes. Stop. Nephew fleeing territory. With a state fund. Stop. Arrest warrant issued for Samuel Hollister. Stop. Governor reviewing Reynolds case. Stop. Stand by for further news. Stop. Natural causes." Nate whispered, the words blurring through sudden tears. He wasn't poisoned at all. Harrington believes the governor will issue a full pardon once Samuel Hollister is apprehended, Gus added. Your name will be cleared. The relief was so profound that Nate felt lightheaded. After months of imprisonment, the terror of escape, weeks of hiding vindication was finally within reach. What do we do now? She asked, wiping away tears. Gus considered their options. We need to get this telegram to the territorial marshal, he decided. He has authority over bounty hunters. If he sees that your case is being reviewed by the governor, he might call off the bounty, Nate finished. But how do we reach him? The nearest marshal's office is in Prescott. There's a deputy marshal who passes through Haven every few weeks, Gus said. According to Martha, he's due tomorrow or the next day. Nate glanced toward the door, beyond which their prisoners waited. And until then, we keep our guests secured, Gus replied grimly, and hope the deputy arrives sooner rather than later. They spent an uncomfortable night taking turns watching the bounty hunters, who alternated between threats and attempts at negotiation. By morning, Nate was exhausted but resolute. Their plan hinged on the deputy marshal's arrival, but there was no guarantee when or if he would come. I'll ride to Haven, Gus decided as they shared a hurried breakfast. Find out if there's any news of the deputy, and send another telegram to Judge Harrington for an update. You can't leave me alone with them, Nate protested, gesturing toward their prisoners. I don't intend to, Gus replied. I'm taking them with me. The plan was risky but necessary. They bound the bounty hunters securely to their saddles, with Gus leading the horses. He would deliver them to the town's makeshift jail, a reinforced storeroom behind the blacksmiths, and explain the situation to Jenkins and other trusted allies. Stay in the cabin, Gus instructed Nate before departing. Keep the shotgun handy. I'll be back by nightfall. Alone again, Nate found herself too restless for domestic tasks. The telegram's promise of exoneration had awakened a hope she'd barely allowed herself to feel. If her name was cleared, she could stop running, stop hiding. She could build a real life in Haven or anywhere else she chose. The freedom was almost dizzying to contemplate. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Nate's thoughts turned increasingly to Gus. He'd risked everything for her, his reputation, his standing in Haven, potentially even his freedom. Why? What had she done to deserve such loyalty from a man who had been a stranger mere weeks ago? The answer, when it came to her, was both simple and profound. Gus helped her because that was who he was, a man who couldn't witness injustice without acting. A man who believed in right and wrong in a world of shifting grays. A man who saw her not as a fugitive or a servant or an orphan, but simply as a person deserving of dignity and freedom. And somewhere along their journey together, that recognition had transformed into something deeper. The realization left Nate breathless. She'd been so focused on survival that she hadn't acknowledged the growing feelings between them, the lingering glances, the comfortable silences, the way his rare smiles made her heart beat faster. She was falling in love with August Blackwood. The sound of approaching horses jerked Nate from her reverie. Multiple riders moving quickly. She grabbed the shotgun and moved to the window, peering cautiously outside. Relief flooded through her at the sight of Gus leading a small party, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. Alongside him rode Jenkins, Dr. Simmons, and a stern-looking man wearing a deputy marshal's badge. Nate opened the cabin door as they dismounted, questions tumbling from her lips. What's happening? Why are you all here? The deputy arrived early, Gus explained, his expression a mixture of excitement and caution. Marshal Thompson, this is Natalie Reynolds. The deputy marshal studied Nate with sharp eyes. Miss Reynolds, he said formally, I've received some interesting telegrams about you today. Nate gripped the doorframe, bracing herself. Sir, One from the governor's office in Prescott, he continued, reaching into his coat. And another from Judge Harrington, whom I respect greatly. He withdrew an official-looking document and handed it to Nate. This is a full pardon, signed by the governor this morning. Samuel Hollister has been apprehended trying to flee to Mexico with embezzled funds. He's confessed to falsifying evidence against you to secure his uncle's estate. Nate stared at the document, unable to comprehend that the nightmare was truly ending. I'm free, she whispered. Legally, yes, the deputy confirmed. Though I understand you've been enjoying a certain kind of freedom already, thanks to Mr. Blackwood here. Gus stepped forward protectively. Any charges against me for aiding her? Considering the circumstances, the governor has declined to pursue the matter, Marshal Thompson replied. Though I'd advise against making a habit of breaking prisoners out of custody. Blackwood. No, sir. Gus agreed, the faintest smile touching his lips. Just this once. The next hours passed in a blur. Dr. Simmons insisted on checking Nate's still healing wrists, pronouncing them on the mend. Jenkins brought news that her position at the store remained open whenever she wished to return. And throughout it all, Gus remained a steady presence at her side, his quiet support anchoring her as the reality of her freedom slowly sank in. When the others finally departed, promising to spread the news of her exoneration throughout Haven, Nate and Gus were left alone in the gathering twilight. I can't believe it's over, Nate said, staring at the pardon she still clutched. After everything. You deserve this, Gus said quietly. A chance to live without looking over your shoulder. To build whatever life you want. Something in his tone caught her attention. Nate looked up, studying his face in the fading light. And what about you, Mr. Blackwood? What do you deserve? He shrugged, suddenly seeming uncertain. I have what I need. Do you? Nate took a step closer. Because I've been thinking about what I want, now that I'm truly free to choose. And I've realized something important. Gus's eyes met hers, a question in their blue depths. The man who found me running with chains, Nate continued softly, who broke them and offered me freedom, he's become more important to me than the freedom itself. Understanding dawned in Gus's expression, followed by a cautious hope. Nate, I want to stay, she said simply. Not because I need protection or shelter, but because I want to be where you are, August Blackwood. For a moment, Gus stood perfectly still, as if afraid any movement might shatter the moment. Then, with deliberate care, he closed the distance between them, raising one hand to gently touch her cheek. I've been alone a long time, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Told myself it was better that way. Safer. He smiled faintly. Then I saw a woman running across the desert, chains on her wrists but fire in her eyes, and everything changed. For me too, Nate whispered. When he kissed her, it felt like the culmination of a journey neither had known they were taking from strangers to allies to something far more profound. His lips were gentle against hers, the kiss a question and an answer both. Stay, Gus murmured when they finally parted. Not just in Haven, but here with me. We can build something together, a home, a life. Yes, Nate replied simply. That's what I want too. As darkness settled over the cabin, they remained on the porch, talking of possibilities, of hopes long deferred now suddenly within reach. The stars emerged above them, witnesses to promises exchanged between two people who had found in each other not just freedom, but belonging. In the years that followed, the story of August Blackwood and Nathaniel Reynolds became something of a legend in Haven. How a taciturn cowboy had broken the chains of a wrongfully accused woman. How they had fought for justice against impossible odds. How they had built a life together, turning Gus's simple cabin into a home that became known throughout the territory for its warmth and hospitality. By 1880, Haven had grown into a proper town with a railroad spur, a schoolhouse, and a newly built church where, on a bright spring morning, August and Nate were finally married in a ceremony attended by the entire settlement. Dr. Simmons stood as Nate's witness, while Jenkins, now mayor of Haven, stood for Gus. Their first child, a daughter they named Elizabeth after Gus's mother, arrived the following year, a strong-willed girl with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit. A son, James, followed 2 years later, completing their family. The Blackwood ranch prospered, expanding beyond the original cabin to include substantial grazing lands and one of the finest horse breeding operations in the territory. Gus continued to work as a scout and guide occasionally, his reputation for honesty and fairness bringing clients from as far away as California. Nate, meanwhile, discovered an unexpected talent for business. What began as managing the ranch's accounts expanded to advising other settlers on financial matters. By 1885, she had established a small but respected banking concern in Haven, providing loans to homesteaders and merchants alike. Through it all, they remained each other's strongest advocates and surest comfort. The chains that had first brought them together, literal and metaphorical both, had been transformed into bonds of choice, of love freely given and received. On their 10th anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their expanded home watching their children play in the twilight, Gus took Nate's hand, his thumb brushing over the faint scars that still marked her wrist. "Do you ever think about that day?" he asked quietly. "When we first met?" Nate nodded, leaning against his shoulder. "Often. How could I not? It was the day everything changed." "I've never told you this," Gus said, "but I almost didn't ride toward you that day. I saw someone in the distance and thought about turning away, avoiding the complication." He shook his head at the memory. "Something made me go toward you instead." "Fate," Nate suggested with a smile. "Maybe," Gus acknowledged. "Or maybe just the fact that even then, something in me recognized something in you. Like we were always meant to find each other." Nate squeezed his hand, remembering the desperate woman she'd been, running across the desert with chains dangling from her wrists. How far she'd come from that moment they both had. "Well, whatever it was," she said softly, "I'm grateful every day that you rode toward trouble instead of away from it." Gus smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Best decision I ever made." As twilight deepened into night, the Blackwood family gathered inside their home, secure in the knowledge that the freedom they'd fought so hard to win had evolved into something even more precious, a life built together, choice by choice, day by day, bound not by chains but by love freely given and joyfully received. And in Haven, Arizona territory, where a cowboy had once found a woman running from chains, that love became their greatest legacy, a reminder that true freedom came not just from broken shackles, but from the courage to build something new from the pieces of what had been broken.